very... You've got to be quite nimble to get in here. Are you right?
Is that right?
You
Very happy.
comfortable?
Sort of. Sort of. As
I always like to
comfortable as
start this off by by saying hi and hello and thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you all. And to find out who has actually seen the painting that we're going to be talking about tonight. Has everybody seen it? Or is some people going on down to see it soon? Okay, well, we're going to assume that... We can't assume anything, can we?
We can't.
Alexander McKenzie is in the Archibald and in the Wynne Prize this year with two very, very distinctive paintings. And as you know, the Archibald subject is Andrew Upton. And the interesting thing that strikes me, first of all, Alexander, is that you talk about yourself as a landscape painter. And I want to know whether you think of yourself as a landscape painter who paints portraits or a portraitist who paints landscapes.
Well, definitely a landscape painter who dabbles in portraiture. For me, portraiture in my practice is very much about context, so the landscape plays an enormously important role in the portraits.
So you wouldn't paint a portrait of somebody with no sort of background?
No. I particularly dislike the big head of the Archibald that's been sort of popular over the last few years. I really enjoy portraits that tell a story, that have an environment, that there's a really strong sense of narrative, and that's what I try and do.
Why did you want to paint Andrew? What was the stimulus here?
Well,
Andrew,
have a look. That's why. I mean, finding an Archibald subject is really about being able to find an Archibald subject. It's not an easy thing to find somebody who's willing to sit for their portrait. So I knew Andrew, of course, and his work and what he does, but specifically, if I had to narrow it down, it's because of his face. And I know he won't mind me saying that he has a terrific face for painting.
What
and
do
radio.
you mean?
It's all radio. Yeah. Now,
what do you mean he's got a terrific face for painting?
Well, when you're painting a portrait, I mean...
Just turn around so everybody can see your face.
You're forced to look at somebody for quite a long period of time. You meet with them and you have the painting and you live with the painting. You have the duration of working the painting, but it sort of hangs around the studio for quite a number of months. So, I want somebody I can sink my teeth into and really get into painting. So, character-driven.
You could say
interesting.
So it's character-driven.
It's a face that's lived, a face that's that you can see behind the face, the sort of the thinking and the sort of the inner of the man, and that's what I want to do. I'm not interested in painting somebody who is particularly pretty or good-looking or.
Well, I was going to say,
Andrew,
I was going to say, and I was going to pull a name like Tom Cruise out of the hat and say, would you want to paint someone like somebody? I don't know, some person with a beautiful face.
Yeah, that's right. Boring.
Yeah.
But Andrew, look at that, terrific, terrific fun.
Andrew, why did you agree to be painted? What was in it?
For those very reasons. I've always felt I had a good character. No, I know Alexander's work. I love I'm of a mind that a painting that tells a story and wrestles with maybe what you call the inner person in the painting is a more interesting painting, and I knew that was Alexander's kind of approach.
So you knew his work?
Yeah, absolutely.
If somebody came to you whose work you didn't know and said, I think you've got a great face and I love your work and I want to paint your portrait, would you be a willing participant, do you think?
I'd have to see their work, but no, probably not. Not as.
You'd Google them immediately and have a look. You would.
No, I'd look into the work definitely.
Yeah.
You've got to feel simpatico. It's quite intimate, because you're giving. There's no point unless you can feel like you can have a proper conversation.
Well, then you'd come at it from a different thing. How important is the chemistry the friendship between you? I mean, did you become good friends through this process?
Yeah, absolutely.
we are.
Yeah, we are. Absolutely. We've you know, the first sitting, you know, in inverted commas, it was us drinking beer. You know, it was a very casual kind of approach. But the reason why that's important, of course, is I needed to gauge, you know, I needed to have a look at him to, you know, to try and see if it was worthwhile painting and if I could make something of it, you know. But secondly, because I had already conceived the idea of what the portrait was going to be, I needed to see whether Andrew was up for it. His personality was someone who would accept what I was trying to do with him, you know, because it's quite a confronting thing, and people tend to be quite guarded if they're going to find that they're going to be depicted in a certain way.
Yeah,
so it's really a personality type that's going to say, okay, well, you know, I'm willing to go with the artist, or I like the idea, rather than saying, look, no, you can only paint me in a certain way because I need to maintain this kind of public appearance.
The public knowledge of you, Andrew, would be as in your role as a playwright and as a director of the Sydney Theatre Company, and so it would strike me that a way of depicting or portraying Andrew would be to show him in that sort of context.
Absolutely, that's the first thing I do when I spoke to Andrew on the phone, and I sort of started to conceive it. Yeah, it was, you know, in the theatre, at a desk, under the spotlight,
with a sort of theatrical sense about
the
it.
curtain, or maybe, you know, studiously studying books and all that business.
But instead, we find him in a boat.
Yes, yeah.
So that makes me ask
natural
you,
progression, isn't it?
Andrew, did boats figure at all in your life?
Well, this is an interesting story, I think, because they don't in any way. I thought. And it's been an interesting journey of uncovery for me, and I assume. What we talked about was the creative process. That was our first, you know, wrestle. And Alexander said, when I get an idea, when I get a painting, it comes to me in a flash. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because that's precisely how I feel about a play, or you read something and you think, you know what that is, or you start to write something and you know what it is, and then the rest of it is just disappointment trying to get there. So we talked about that, and he said, and he was softening me up, obviously, because he said, because actually I've had the flash of the painting, and it's you in a boat. And I went, oh, that's absurd. What do you think I am, some Chardonnay-sipping harbour dweller?
Well, you are a harbour dweller at the Sydney Theatre Company,
I
aren't
am,
you?
but I'm not one of those ones on boats.
Yeah.
Swans around.
I mean, that was the only connection with being in a boat shed at the Sydney Theatre Company. Well, it's not a boat shed, but that, you know, the
It is a
finger
boat
wall.
shed.
Yeah.
It's as cold as
Yeah.
a boat shed. So it seemed silly and mad. But then as we talked, I said, well, actually, I spent a lot of my childhood in the northern beaches, and I used to row a lot with my cousins in... this is a long story, but I really like it. That's all true. I used to row a lot with them, and they're very, very important memories, rowing around the Pittwater, you know, as this is like 9, 10, 11-year-old children. So I said, that's sort of interesting. And then it dawned on me that I was deep in the middle of reading, at the time, Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, which I had never read at my young age, but was fast becoming, you know, one of my favourite books. And I thought, I said, well, that's interesting, because that's obviously set at sea. And I thought over it, and I thought, as I came up with my list of favourite books, the books that was toppling were Moby Dick and Heart of Darkness, also by Joseph Conrad. So there's a lot of the sort of the sea in how I perceive creativity, I think. And I imagine maybe there's something there. And then it dawned on me even further, much later, when the picture was hung, and I said to Alexander that actually the first thing I ever wrote, you know, when I thought I want to be a writer, I'm going to sit down and write a story, was a story about a person who identified themselves as a boat. So unbeknownst to me, but unbeknownst to him, he had kind of completely dug into something.
Wow.
It was strangely very central to certainly my creative process. Anyway.
Wouldn't Freud love all of this, eh? Fantastic. But the interesting thing, when you look at the the painting that that is hung in the Wynne Prize, which is about bushfires, which is one of the most mysterious paintings I think in the whole show, and it follows in the tradition of your work, which I think is very mystical and very mythical and very strange, and it's got the weird picture of trees apparently sort of bursting into flames spontaneously, not surrounded by bush but surrounded by water. And we find Andrew not surrounded by water, he's almost on the shore, isn't he, in this painting?
Yes, yeah.
Which is interesting, and there's little sort of symbolic things in the painting. I think there's a strong relationship between these two paintings, actually.
Yeah, I think so too. They were both done at the same time, so the way I work is to work many pictures at the same time. But these two particularly were done side by side, so there is sort of cross-referencing myself.
Do you expect your audience to think about the symbolism that you put in there?
I would hope so. I mean, the symbolism that takes place in Andrew's portrait and in the landscape are absolutely central to my practice. So one would hope that people find their own reference in it. But
Can you talk about the symbolism and what it is, or why it is included in your paintings?
Well, for me, it doesn't really feel like a sort of symbolist device. It feels entirely rational and like a language. The imagery that I put down in the pictures is telling a story, and it makes perfect sense for me. I never really liked the idea of artists saying, that the public must take their own kind of explanation from the work. That always struck me as rather lazy. There's a very definite idea in the work, but at the same time, I struggle to wrap that explanation into words, because and I think I might have mentioned it before, it's a pictorial language, so it doesn't lend itself to being described as succinctly as a kind of explanation or a soundbite. It's a much more complex thing, and there's levels that take place within those symbols. So in the way that we see symbols and signs in our life, they can be taken for different meaning depending on where you are in your own journey.
Does it matter to you if somebody takes an entirely different from the intended
Not
meaning?
at all, not at all. The painting is a weird thing because it's an entirely kind of self-gratifying thing.
I could chuck something into words that might elucidate further. Part of the sitting process involved me getting between two chairs and looking like I was rowing, because I obviously don't have a boat, and Alexander asked me to look over my shoulder, and that's where he was photographing. And I said, "What, am I looking at something bad up ahead, or am I looking at where I'm going?" And he said, "Well, ideally both." So I think the symbols are about being able to be read openly.
Yeah, and I knew that when that painting was coming together was, Andrew asked me the question, am I stuck on the rocks, or am I going away and just sort of pushing off the rocks? And I said, look, I don't really know. The image is there for me, and my job in this process as a painter is to perhaps raise the question, but it's certainly not to provide answers.
There's a sort of a surrealist quality about the fact that he is so close to shore and yet he seems to be rowing.
Yes,
isn't there?
Yeah, and that's a deliberate device.
There's a life belt or a life ring, and there's a buoy, and there are figures in the very forefront of the. You were talking
there's
about
the fish as well, the catch of fish.
What do they represent? I mean, do we? Can I ask you that, or is that?
Yeah, no, I don't mind. I mean, the fish, the catch of fish is his children.
His children?
Poor fellows.
Yeah.
I eat my children.
How many little mackerel have you got now?
3. No, we did talk about this because that was another part about the whole creative
you both
process.
have 3 children.
Yeah.
And are they much the same age?
It's similar age there. They're all young and hard work. Yeah.
And yours make a contribution to your painting, a literal contribution.
They do. There's the odd sort of.
People,
well, they tend to run into the studio and stick pink on anything possible. So if you look closely, you'll find little daubs of pink quite often in the picture, and that's my girls doing that for me.
When you
got
said
boys.
paintings come to you, tell me what you mean.
Literally, and I've heard other people talk about this too. Not specifically painters, but writers and playwrights. That creative ideas just quite often appear. So they'll appear in the back of my head, somewhere about here, entirely fully formed, on the wall, finished.
You see the painting.
See absolutely everything. Yeah.
So then you've just got to actually make
then
it.
there's this kind of torturous process of trying to make that image into a
So
reality.
you saw Andrew Upton in a boat,
Absolutely.
close to shore.
Yep.
Those things. Really?
Absolutely, the entire thing, and making it is of course a difficult and different process to bring it into reality. And I did tell a different story on Friday, which was quite interesting. That I did ask, because I use photography in the portraits. It's a kind of a debatable thing, but necessary. Andrew has time constraints, etc. So I got him to sit in his office and pretend to row a boat, and he thought I was completely mad. And then I went home and had my wife photograph me in a boat in my neighbour's backyard. And we didn't have any oars, so we improvised with a couple of the 3-year-old's toy brooms. So I'm sitting on the grass with these toy brooms, pretending I'm in a boat. Andrew's in his chair, pretending he's rowing the boat, and somehow they came together to make the painting.
Can you relate to that as a playwright?
I relate to the agony of cutting and pasting and hodging and podging to get to something that you've seen whole and perfect and beautiful.
Because
funny.
authors often
Sad.
novelists often say that characters take on a life of their own and do their own.
Well, that's part of the hodgepodge. As a writer, I don't know how that
No, it's the same.
pans out as a painter.
It's exactly the same, yeah. Once you start the painting process, then it's telling its own...
It's anybody's game.
Is that a way that we could describe what the creative process is about then?
An
Is it,
attempt
or-
at getting to something that you know is there.
How do you know when you've got it?
I've never got it, so... No, seriously.
That's why he keeps writing and I keep painting. We're trying to get somewhere. We're not quite sure how to get there. Yeah.
You were saying to me just before we started here that this painting and all portraits for you start with the head.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
What, it's a head floating on a
Yeah,
canvas?
yeah. If you're
Literally?
talking about like a systematic way of working it, there's a head floating on the canvas. It's very Monty Python. So it's just sort of floating around, and I'll paint the head in usually one sitting. Because it has to be fresh and it has to have the kind of vigorous paint quality. But if I can't get the head, I'll just abandon the whole thing. So luckily with the great face for painting, the head came together really well, so I carried on with the rest of the picture.
What does the lantern, the light, mean in this painting?
Well, I think that's one of those symbols that can be interpreted a number of different ways. And again, perhaps I'm not quite sure, but is it the guiding force in his light? Is it he's obviously
I like to sit as my
pushing
wife.
the boat?
You what?
I like to sit as my wife.
Or
Yeah.
is it Kate? Yeah, that's the other one.
Your wife or your life, or are they both
Wife.
the same
Wife.
thing? The light is your wife, you think? It's a nice idea, isn't it? The fish are your children, the light is your wife. And you're marooned on the rocks.
Well, I don't think I'm marooned.
I hope it doesn't mean this marriage is on the rocks, for God's
I think
sake.
I'm just setting out on a great journey.
Yeah, that's the question. Is he marooned on the rocks? I don't know. I see him, is much the same sort of predicament as I see myself. Is that you're charged as a father and as the male role in the family. You're rowing the boat. You're the engine. You've got the responsibility of the kids. You've got you've got the lovely wife. You've got to keep the whole thing together. You're the
Yeah.
captain in this scenario, and that's an onerous responsibility. When you add to it the thing that both of us have, is that at the same time we're trying to maintain our independent, creative selves and produce work that's valid and interesting. Then you get a real problem, and that's what we kind of we relate on that point,
Which is what we talked about over the beer.
Yeah.
Can I get into that touchy subject of prizes for art? What do you think, Andrew? I mean, do you?
I'm actually not a believer, even though my wife has garnered many, and I think it's a wonderful way to help structure people's appreciation, I suppose, if I can be so constructivist. But essentially, it's so nebulous. I love the idea that selections are hung. I think that's fair enough. There is a winnowing process, but finally saying what's what is, I mean, it's as random as fashion, which is fun. But that's my
What
opinion.
do you think, Alexander? I mean, do you think what's the value?
Well,
What's the value for an artist like you? Because you've been hung how many times in the Archibald and how many in the Win?
four Archibalds, five or six wins. I think.
Right.
Never won, of course. Thanks very much.
Next year. Paint
I think it's valid and it's important because we're all sitting here talking about painting, and that's fabulous. You know, we're not at home.
It draws attention to it.
Yeah, it draws
I
attention.
think that's
We're
what I
not.
meant,
We're not.
help
We're not here.
structure
You know,
appreciation.
we're not all watching television or you know talking about football or something. We're talking about painting, and I think that's the driving factor. You know,
Was
so-
painting always your way of expressing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
From what age?
Mum has all the little kind of drawings from when I was tiny, and I had a specific set aside room in the house from 11 to paint.
For you to paint it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah.
it was fostered by your family, obviously.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, they've always been very supportive. I was crap at everything else, really.
Oh, yeah? What about you, Andrew? Was writing
I was
always...
definitely crap at everything else.
But was it always playwriting rather than...
It was actually. I mean, look, I had
Really
my own
interested in that.
strangely dedicated room, which was, my father was a big subscriber to the theatres at the time, the Nimrod and the Sydney Theatre Company when it came into being, and I was, you know, there were an amount of tickets, and I was often one of the ones that went. I just love. You make these strange connections. Painting isn't for everyone, theatre isn't for everyone, but when you make them, you sort of follow them.
Yeah.
I think I wrote my first play at about 16.
And you've been collecting ever since, I think, haven't you? You wrote
Collecting
your first play, sorry.
Yeah.
When did you acquire your first painting?
Oh, heavens.
Much later.
Much later, ages later.
Before I let you go, I've got to ask both of you what you're working on now. What are you working on now, Andrew?
I'm just about to start directing Long Day's Journey into Night. And I'm just finished the first draft of the adaptation of Uncle Vanya.
You've got a big year.
Yeah, quite a lot.
Okay, and what about what's on the is there a canvas on the...
There's a lot, yeah. I've a show in September.
Do you work on the wall, on the floor?
No,
on
they're
what?
all on milk crates, you
Yeah.
know, stacked around the room. So there's about 10 or so pictures on the moment for the show in September, and then I have another show in Melbourne in November, and then a show next year in the UK. So it's kind of...
Fantastic.
It doesn't really stop. Yeah.
Thank you both.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting. And please join me thanking these two.